The next session coming up is on the British Heritage Railways, Change and Challenges by Paul Whittle, a subject very relevant to us in India also. Incidentally, the session is going to be moderated by a dear senior colleague, Mr. Sanjay Mukherjee. As his introduction will show, he also has had his hand in making some rail museums, whereas he has been posted earlier. A professional railwayman, Sanjay Mukherjee retired from service as a member of the Indian Railways Board as the latter's financial commissioner. Holding various key positions in the Indian Railways, he has always been keen on rail heritage and was instrumental in the setting up of the very well appointed Rail Museum at Tinsukia in Assam, where he was the divisional railway manager. He is currently the head of the East and Northeast chapter of the Rail Enthusiast Society and the main force behind its activities and success. He has authored a number of books, most of them rail based. He contributes regularly to the Society's magazine. Of course, the introduction is too short, but then the time also is too short. I would request Mr. Mukherjee to take over and lead the next session as the moderator. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Manoj. I hope I am audible.
Yes.
Okay.
Very audible.
And visible. And visible.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Paul Whittle. He is a member of the Rail Enthusiast Society, so I give this as his first introduction, a very loved member. He will be speaking on Britain's heritage, railways, changes and challenges. Mr. Whittle's professional career was with the British banks in the City of London. He also served for 34 years in the Royal Corps of Signals, Territorial Army, and gained the Territorial Decoration. After retirement, he went ahead with public speaking on his hobbies, especially on travel, railways, and military history throughout the UK and even on cruise ships. Paul has had a lifelong interest in railways. He is a member of the National Transport Trust of UK, the Heritage Railway Association, and several British heritage railways. In 2002, he was a lead speaker at India's National Conference of Steam Heritage Tourism and has featured in the 218 TV documentary series entitled How Trains Changed the World. He is the present vice chairman of the Darjeeling Himalayan Society, an author himself, an excellent rail photographer and nature photographer. He is the principal link between the DHRS, the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway Society of UK, and the Indian Railways, especially vis-a-vis the development and preservation of the DHR, the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway. He's a regular visitor to this country and, as I said, a loved member of the RES. As a keen traveler, he's visited over 70 countries, including railway systems in Eritrea, India, Myanmar, in Syria, Jordan, Peru, Russia, and what have you. Today, he speaks on the subject of Britain's heritage railways, changes and challenges. There are three segments on which he will be focusing. The first is the present, which gives the overview of the remarkable scale and diversity of Britain's heritage railways. One of them being the National Rail Museum, of course, a repository of the British railway history. Second is the new builds, the examples of projects currently being undertaken in Britain for long lost examples of steam, diesel, and even electric traction. And of course, the future, the challenges, environmental, financial, staffing, safety, technical skilling, customer expectations, and more. Paul, the floor is all yours. We are all ears. Welcome to our conference.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy, and greetings from the UK. It's lovely to be back with all of you again, and my congratulations to RES for mounting yet another of these splendid international conferences. Bear with me a second while I see if I can get my pictures up on the screen for you.
Yes. It's at the bottom.
No.
Yeah, done. Excellent.
Yeah. Yep, good. All right. Okay. Anyway, off we go. We've had a splendid introduction from Sanjoy, from Charlotte, about the national side of our celebrations. But as you've heard already, 2025 is a really splendid year for us. And it may perhaps be that during the later this year, some of you would like to come over and start and share in those celebrations. So as Sanjoy said, we'll start off with an overview of what our heritage railways are looking like today. To be quite honest, the scale and the diversity of our heritage railway sector surprises us even sometimes there. And you might be surprised to know that almost uniquely in the world, we are turning out new steam locomotives on a fairly regular basis. And I'll give you several examples of the projects associated with that. And then from the present, we'll move on to the future. There are all sorts of challenges facing our heritage railways, and I'll talk you through them and suggest how it's going to work out in the future. So a little bit of background, first of all, about our national railway network. In terms of the infrastructure and some of the major stations, they're in the hands of Network Rail, which is a government body. Altogether, we've got a network of just under 10,000 route miles of track. Passenger levels and freight tonnages are just about up to what they were before the COVID emergency. 1.7 billion passengers a year and over 110 million tons of freight. In terms of the actual train operating, we've got train operating companies, and they have worked to a series of franchises given to them by the government. We're in a sort of two-phase at the moment. Some of those franchises have been taken over back under central government control. Sometimes it has to be admitted because the individual companies weren't performing up to the right standard. But the remaining private TOCs are actually themselves being brought back under central government control. It's part of the present government's nationalisation policy. In complete contrast, for the freight companies, they were never nationalised. They're a series, perhaps half a dozen, of independent companies. They're responsible for their own rolling stock, and they pay a lease to be allowed to run their trains on the national network. Now, our network is admittedly much, much smaller than it used to be. And if we look at this, 15-year period after the end of the last war, you can see that between 1948 and 1962, we lost over 3,000 miles of railway. And that was simply because they were loss-making and there was no form at the time of subsidizing their operations for the public benefit. Even after that slimming down, if you look at a map of our national network in 1963, even after the closure of a lot of these generally rural branch lines, we still had a pretty intensive network. And wherever you were in the UK, you were never very, very far from a railway station. But the financial losses continued. Road competition was taking away passengers, it was taking away freight, and to stop this hemorrhaging of financial losses, then the government brought in the sometimes perhaps now notorious Dr. Beeching. And he, as a result of that, over the 10-year period after his report had come out in 1963, we lost another 4,000 miles of track, and hundreds of stations and communities all over the country suddenly found they were a long, long way from their nearest railway station. If there's any silver lining to that dark cloud, it was that in the years to come after this, if anyone was thinking about reopening a stretch of track on a private basis, as happened, then there was a wonderful selection of track routes available across the country for reopening. In fact, actually, one of the little narrow gauge railway had already reopened way back in 1951. And in the middle of Wales, something happened which happened nowhere else before in the world. A group of basically young volunteers decided that you were going to run a railway. And the Chalathyn Railway had opened in 1865, 7 miles long, 2 foot 3 inches between the rails, and that was to service slate mines, bringing the slate down to a port there. At the time, no one really thought that they would succeed. It was a completely different concept. Young, unpaid people running a railway, but they succeeded. And today, the Chalathyn Railway is a major contributor to the tourist income in this part of Wales. Now, restoring fairly small equipment on a narrow gauge is one thing. Doing it for a full-size standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5 inches, is another. But if we come forward to 1960, then the Bluebell Railway in the county of Sussex to the south of London started reopening that railway. And today it is in the absolute first division of our heritage railways. You can see it took them quite a long time to complete their route. What happened at the northern end was that after the line had been closed by British Railways, a cutting was acquired by the local authority, who had the incredible idea of turning it into a great big waste tip. And to reopen the railway several decades later, the Bluebell Railway had to raise the money and the resources and so on there for that great big municipal tip to be emptied so that the cutting could be restored there. But today, here's a snapshot of 4 aspects of the Bluebell Railway. If you're only going to visit one heritage railway in the UK, then it will probably be this one. It's within easy reach of London. They've got a fantastic range of steam locomotives, other equipment, and so on there. And looking at this map, this was produced by the Heritage Railway Association. It's a tiny bit outdated, but if you concentrate on all those little red dots, then every little red dot is a heritage railway. And so, as you can see, we've got wonderful coverage across the entire country now. The economic benefit of our heritage railways is not generally known, but very, very substantial indeed. In terms of the economic benefit to communities around these routes there, it's it's estimated that it's about £600 million or 60 crore there. This is the sort of income which is generated by people visiting a railway. They buy their souvenirs, their ice creams, they stay in local accommodation. They also, there's £600 million of benefit, sometimes in parts of the country where there isn't much else economic activity. And as you can see at the bottom, for the fully paid jobs that are needed, the jobs possibly on some of the engineering facilities, manning the telephones, catering and so on there are about 4,100 people who are paid either on a full-time or a part-time basis. The trade body responsible for the heritage railways is the Heritage Railway Association. So it's not a government body, it's a volunteer organisation, and the HRA represents the interests of all our heritage railways. It has about 170 members, and actually those 170 members do indeed include such other activities like cliff railways, or some museums and some tramway activity as well. So if new legislation is coming up, then the HRA will examine that new government legislation and consider if there are any impacts on heritage railways and advise government accordingly. So there's a lot of advice being given. They're heavily into training, and on an annual basis, HRA awards a great big event, and the individual railways put forward applications for a reward under various different categories. A new locomotive project, restoring a carriage, opening a station, and that sort of thing there. Just to give you one or two of the more important statistics, it's quite surprising that on an annual basis, 13 million of us take a ride on a steam railway. In terms of where we go, well, it's a wonderful choice. Across the country, there are almost 400 miles of standard gauge. So as I say, that's our 4 foot 8.5 inches, and almost 200 miles of narrow gauge. And what we call narrow gauge is about slightly under 2 foot, which is 610 millimetres. Below that, we call anything a miniature railway rather than a narrow gauge railway. The railway network as restored is almost entirely single track because those routes tended to be lesser used and rural routes themselves. But there is one example here where a double track main line has become a restored heritage railway. And this is the Great Central Railway. It was the last line to be completed between Manchester and London. It duplicated other routes, so it was shut down under rationalisation there. But here, the restored section of the Great Central Railway has a higher speed limit. Now, the national speed limit for heritage railways is 25 miles an hour. Not very fast, but you're not going on one for speed. You're going to look out at the window and admire the scenery. But the Great Central Railway, because it has a fairly straightforward route, it hasn't any level crossings to worry about, it can run trains on occasions at much, much higher than that 25 miles an hour. In fact, it's much used by manufacturers of new railway equipment because they can run their test trains up and down here rather than trying to fit them in on an increasingly busy main line network. The stations, well, over 450 of them, all beautifully restored to period perfect detail, and in some cases involving a huge amount of money and effort because some of these stations had lain completely derelict and vandalized after their lines had shut down. So here we're up in Yorkshire on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, and that attractive overall roof had been taken down and thrown away. And so the restoration did include having to recreate this very attractive feature of the station. Another fairly early station, let's pop back for a second there, our biggest heritage railway station is at Horsley Keynes. So that's on the Bluebell Railway. And this has no less than 5 platform faces to it. So on one of their special gala events there, this is really buzzing with train arriving and departing. And not forgetting the narrow gauge, this is a fairly simple wooden and corrugated iron and slate construction on the Festering Railway up in North Wales. On the right-hand side, you can see a volunteers hostel, and it's in a fairly remote part of the territory. Volunteers come to work on the railway from far and wide, and so it's a great advantage if they actually got somewhere to stay over the night while they're doing a stint of several days volunteering on the railway. Carriages, well, a fleet of over 1,400 of them. We're down on the Severn Valley Railway at Kidderminster for this one. And this is a very attractive collection of wooden bodied carriages were built for the London North Eastern Railway. And in their time, they would have been servicing the top class express passenger trains from King's Cross up to Scotland. By far the most common coaches in service on heritage railways are examples of these. So the British Railways Standard Mark I, all steel, built over a 25-year period there. They were produced in their thousands by British Railways to replace a largely worn out fleet after the pressures of the last war. They're still in service, not just on heritage railways in their hundreds, but also some still are allowed out on the main line. And if you're a filmmaker and you want to show a typical British passenger train of any period from 1951 onwards, then you can use these and it will realistically portray the sort of carriages. All you need to do perhaps is give it a different coat of paint to reflect the particular railway carriage livery of the time there. So there are a lot of these around there. They're very, very popular. Even today, heritage railways will get an unexpected phone call, perhaps from a farmer. And the farmer says, well, I've finished with my piggery or my chicken shed. Would you like it? And on inquiry, they find that this chicken shed was actually a slowly rotting away wooden-bodied carriage from a long, long time ago. So the offer is always gratefully accepted. It's put on a low loader. It's taken off to the railway's carriage and wagon works. And here we are down at Sheffield Park on the Bluebell Railway. And a collection of fairly rotten wood will be painstakingly restored. You can see the variety of the workforce there, they're all volunteers in this picture there. It doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair, if you've got the training already, or you're happy to be trained, these heritage railways will be delighted to use you. And so after a lot of money and a lot of effort, the finished product brings a huge amount of satisfaction to the people who have done the job, and of course even more to the people who can luxuriate in this old time style of carriage travel. On the narrow gauge, very few of the original carriages have survived, so most of the ones that are in service now are replicas. We're on another 2-foot narrow gauge line. This is at Leighton Buzzard. It was a line designed to carry sand from quarries down to the main line, and this is at the southern end of the line at Prince's Park at Leighton Buzzard. Inside, in complete contrast, this is an almost brand new carriage on the Festiniog Railway. Built very luxuriously, tables, nice upholstery. The plastic screens were a temporary measure put in during the COVID emergency so that the railway could continue to operate passenger travel. And this little thing here is actually so small, it's called a bug box. And it may be a third-class carriage, but undoubtedly the passengers are enjoying a first-class ride in it. You can see how old it is, 1863. And we believe this is the oldest narrow-gauge carriage still in passenger service today. And now, for every one person who's interested in the steam engine, there are at least 2 or 3 who are equally or even more interested in diesel locomotives. I think the enthusiasm comes really from remembering what you remember in your own youth. So the steam locomotives enthusiasts tend to be a generation older than some of these who are more passionate about diesel locomotives. This one we're showing here is one of the most popular. They were built, over 200 of them. They're now, 60 years old, 70 years old there. And a few are still on service on the national network. This one here is on the Wensleydale Railway in North Yorkshire. This rather bigger one, it's got 2,000 horsepower under its bonnet. Produced 1958 to 1962, and it was diesels of this type, which at the time, pre-electrification, would have hauled the mainline express passenger trains from London up to Scotland. It's now working out its retirement in the East Lancashire Railway in northwest England. This is a fairly cheap and cheerful form of rail transport. The Pacers were built to spare shutting down quite a lot of unremunerative branch lines. They were cheap and cheerful. They were based on a bus. The underframe came from a British Railways freight wagon. The body came from a British Leyland bus. You could usually tell when it was raining because they tended to leak. If you were prone to seasickness on jointed track, they would nod up and down, a little bit like a nodding donkey. So they weren't everyone's favorite, but they had big windows. They're ideal for looking out of. They saved many non-profit making branch lines for shutting down. And they're still in service, several of them on heritage railways. And here we are again up in Yorkshire on the Wensleydale Railway. On the narrow gauge, 300 narrow gauge diesels of all shapes and sizes. The little grey one on the right hand side, that's way up in the north of England on the South Towndale Railway. Wagons, well, our heritage railways, they don't run their routes from a seaport to a big city, from a coal mine to a factory, but it's all part of recreating the atmosphere of days gone by. And so you'll find that these heritage railways, albeit some of them don't actually even run freight services at all, they will assemble a representative collection of old-time freight wagons. So here we are up in the North Yorkshire moors. And if we look at the siding in the foreground, bottom right, that was a general standard goods van. It could carry absolutely anything. Next to it, slightly open-sided, that is a wagon designed for the transport of cattle. The blue wagon that is on a 6-wheel chassis, and this was used by the Express Dairy Company. And overnight trains will bring fresh milk down, say, for example, the southwest of England up to London and the other big cities there. In fact, some of the railways do operate freight services. It's not to transport the goods, it's simply to put on a photographic opportunity for someone who wants to see an old style goods train there. This one was on the Great Central Railway. It's a very long one. It's got all manner of goods wagons on there. It could be any time from 1950s onwards there. In some ways, it's slightly unrealistic because the locomotives hauling goods trains tended not to be nearly so clean as they are. And sometimes the charterer of one of these freight trains will specifically ask for the locomotive to be dirtied so that his photograph looks a little bit more period authentic. But what happened to all those old steam locomotives, of which we had thousands? Well, the mainline operation of steam locomotives by British Railways ended in 1968. But for a couple of decades before, redundant or life-expired steam locomotives were being scrapped. Some of them were being scrapped in the railway's own workshops, but as the numbers increased, some of them were sent off to privately owned scrapyards. And here we come to what is now generally regarded as the Barry miracle, because just under 300 locomotives were sent off to Barry Scrapyard in South Wales. Well, at the time, Di Woodham, who owned the scrapyard, had also bought thousands of old redundant goods wagons, and his workforce was so heavily engaged in cutting up the goods wagons, which were much easier to cut up than a steam locomotive, and he simply parked up his 300 or so locomotives in the sidings. It wasn't too long before these new railway revivalists, as you might call them there, were beating a path to his door and saying, well, can I buy that one over there? Or can I buy a bit of that one over there? And Di Woodham very quickly realized that he was going to make a lot more money by not scrapping his locomotives and just waiting for people to come and buy them from him. And that is exactly what happened. So by the time his scrapyard closed in 1990, almost all the locomotives that had gone there for being cut up had been saved. Now, it's a long time since then. Some of them are still in ex-scrapyard conditions there, but the large majority are either back in operational service or undergoing restoration. And it gave us a breathing space. We think of other countries where the complete fleet of steam engines has been withdrawn, sent off to scrap and melted down. And so they have lost a huge opportunity, and we can be forever grateful to Di Woodham, who is almost of saint status amongst our rail enthusiasts there, for having given our preserved railways that opportunity to raise money and then gradually to bring back these steam locomotives into power. So altogether, in one shape or form, we have got around the country over 500 steam locomotives. This one here is called Evening Star, and she was the last steam locomotive built for British Railways. She wasn't in operational service with them for very long at all, just a few years, quite literally. She was supposed to be a freight locomotive, so she should have been painted black. But because she was the last locomotive to be built, and she was being built at Swindon Works, at the former Great Western Railway, they decided they would do something special. So they gave her a special green coat of paint. They had a competition amongst the workforce, and the winning entry for the name was Evening Star. And here she is on display at our National Railway Museum in York, that you've heard about already. In contrast to many other countries where you will go there to photograph your steam locomotive, and you'll find that almost always it's black. It might have red underframes on, but in the UK, you will have a kaleidoscope of colour, because these locomotives are largely being restored to the livery of when they were operating for their constituent, the company that built them. So we're up in Scotland for this one, and this is a locomotive built for the Caledonian Railway back in 1899. And here we are, a different livery, a different part of the world. We're down in southwest England. We're on the long West Somerset Railway, one of our longer heritage railways. And this was a Great Western Railway pannier tank built in 1934. On the narrow gauge, we've got over 150 locomotives. This one here is seen at the Statfold Railway Centre in the Midlands. And you can see that to drive the front at the front there, well, you hope it's not raining too hard. It hasn't even got an enclosed cab. And sometimes you'll visit a heritage railway and the locomotive won't have come from this country at all. And this one has a really interesting history because it was built in America in 1917, and it was part of a fleet of hundreds which were sent off to Northwest Europe for this very extensive network of narrow gauge lines serving the frontline trenches. So the roads had become quagmires after heavy rain, and it was the narrow gauge railways that brought men and munitions up from the rear areas up to the front line. After the end of World War I, it came to India, and you can see it was into the 1980s. It was at the Upper India sugar mills at Uttar Pradesh. I'm not quite sure exactly when it came back to the UK, but it's been nicely restored and is earning its retirement keep again on the 2-foot gauge now Leighton Buzzard Railway. And this is the unusual type of locomotive. It's called a double fairley. It's on the Festiniog Railway in North Wales, and it's rather like two small steam locomotives back to back, joined at the hip. So it's got these powered bogies front and back. It's got 2 boilers, 2 chimneys, but it only needs 1 2-man crew in the middle. And it's powerful, it's flexible, it copes with the severe gradients and the very tight curves of this very, very scenic railway in North Wales. A limited number of steam locomotives are allowed back out on the main line. After 1968, there was a period when no steam locomotives, or almost none, were allowed on the main line. British Railways thought it was rather bad for their image. They didn't want to see steam locomotives working. But common sense soon prevailed. It was realised that these would generate income, and they were slowly allowed out. But to put your steam locomotive onto the main line, then you've got a few hoops to jump through. First of all, it has got to be in absolutely perfect working order. And it must be able to haul a long train of 12, 15 carriage there, not at 30 or 40 miles an hour. It's got to be able to go running consistently at 60 or 70 miles an hour, because it's got to be its schedule has got to be slotted in onto a busy main line between all the other trains running. And there's a financial penalty if your steam locomotive fails or breaks down or doesn't run fast enough. If you end up delaying other national network trains, there is a financial penalty for the operator of the steam special there. So there's every incentive for keeping your locomotive in tip-top condition. And of course, it needs to have all the communications and safety equipment installed. They've got to be able to communicate with the increasingly computerized and centralized signaling system. So this one here, Britannia, she was built in 1951. And after the war, British Railways built a fleet of a standard type of locomotive, and they built 999 of them altogether. One of our most scenic stretches of main line is the Settle and Carlisle Railway in northwest England, and it's a favourite location for some of these regular steam charters. They're widely advertised in the press, in the railway magazines and so on. So here again, we've got a privately owned steam locomotive, a privately owned fleet of carriages heading south along this really attractive piece of railway route. One of our most famous railway locations is in Western Scotland, and this is the Glenfinnan Viaduct. It looks as though it's made of stone. It's actually made of concrete, and it's along this route that the famous Jacobite Express runs every summer. Between about May and September, October, there'll be a 2 trains a day service along this line between a place called Fort William and Mallaig. And if any of you just happen to be fans of the Harry Potter series of films, then you'll know that Harry Potter had his fictitious ride up to Scotland on a train like this, the Jacobite. Now, this is a restored diesel, and it looks quite modern, doesn't it? But it's not. The vehicles themselves are part of one of the early intercity 125 fleet. So they started to be built as long ago as 1978, but they do look modern. They set a new standard with air conditioning, comfort, speed, and so on there. And they've remained the backbone of our diesel fleet intercity until very, very recently. Some 125s are actually still in service, for example, up in Scotland there. In this case, the train has been liveried in the colours of a slightly older, much smaller fleet of diesel units called the Blue Pullmans. There weren't many of them. They were built in 1960. They weren't really a success. They were a tiny little bit ahead of their time, but they looked the same as the 125s there. And as I say, even to this day, it's not a million miles different from the appearance of a Van der Barrett, I think you'd agree. What about all the staff who work on these railways? Well, we've mentioned the 4,000 paid staff, but look, they're vastly outnumbered by the volunteers, about 22,000 in the last count. This happy bunch are on the Western Wensleydale Railway in North Yorkshire, and you need a lot of volunteers. The guards van on the left-hand side is on the Bluebell Railway, and the Bluebell Railway runs for very much of the year. So to put a guard on this one, well, the volunteer who is the guard, he can perhaps only do 2 or 3 days volunteering a month. So you need probably 6 to 10 guards on a roster able to step in and be a guard on that service. And if you're a husband and wife team, you'll certainly be welcomed. And all the jobs are open to men or women. So it's not just the front line operating that you see as a visitor. You'll have people up in the signal boxes. You'll be being responsible for manning the level crossings and a host of other activities, vacancies to be filled. If you fancy do silver service, or if you're a cook, a chef, you'll get a lot of pleasure and learn a lot of money for your Heritage Railway by being part of the dining carriage team. And I think this small group they're I think on the Bluebell Railway, and they enjoy what they're doing. And as you'll see from the figures a little bit later on, these dining carriages on train catering really bring in a lot of income for the railways. You also need in your team people who really understand how to maintain some of the bigger structures, the stations, for example, the bridges, the culverts, and so on. This is an impressive viaduct on the Gloucestershire and Warwickshire Railway, and it recently needed a lot of love and attention. It was getting quite elderly and quite leaky there. So you need people who understand structures, building surveyors, and so on there, sometimes to simply repair something, or in this case, to replace completely a bridge which was failing. So this is one on the Welsh Highland Railway. An unusual locomotive is crossing it. This one spent most of its time out in South Africa before being brought over here to Wales. And you need gardeners. All of these heritage railways are very, very proud of their gardens. And so there's a constant need for people to come along and do the weeding, the planting, the cutting the grass, and so on. This is at Arley Station on the Severn Valley Railway. And what about the track? Well, if you take the top left-hand picture, looks very, very professional. A lot of big machinery. Everyone in that picture there, I think, was a volunteer. Some of the machinery is either owned by the railway or probably hired in for a special event there. And there's some very, very unglamorous work to be done. Bottom left, well, for each mile of track, you've got 2 miles of boundary in some shape or form. Most of it has to be fenced. And so it's got to be constantly, the trees are got to be pruned back. What about the drains? The railway only owns the land that it operates on. A couple of yards either side of the track, it is privately owned land, and across that land will flow streams and rivers and ditches and so on there. And if you don't look after your own ditches along the railway boundary, then you are in really, really big trouble. Bottom right, we're on the Bluebell Railway. A set of points is being replaced. Now, that would actually mean overnight working. They don't want to stop the trains for more than they absolutely have to. So when you volunteer to do the track work there, occasionally you'll be told, well, okay, don't come at 9 o'clock in the morning. You're going to need to come at 9 o'clock at night for this particular assignment. What about new steam locomotives? Well, it's delightful to report that we are, as I mentioned, turning out new steam locomotives on standard gauge on a fairly regular basis. It all started with the project back in 1994 to recreate an A1 class Pacific. So these were built for the London North Eastern Railway. And you can see it took a long time, 14 years altogether. It took a long time to raise £3 million or 0.3 crores, but it did prove that across the country, there was the enthusiasm, there was the enough people to raise enough money to produce it. There were the engineering skills to manufacture it. And since it came into service in 2008, it's been a major success. And it encouraged other groups to get together and to do something different. And they started looking through their books there and identifying extinct types of steam locomotive and thought, well, let's build a new one. So the Great Western Railway had a class of 460s called the Saint class. They were all scrapped, but at the Great Western Society depot at Didcot, to the west of London, they decided they would recreate one. In fact, they had a bit of an advantage with recreating this one, Lady of Legend. She was completed in 2019. But in this case, they didn't have to build absolutely everything from scratch. The boiler and I think part of the frames actually came from other redundant examples of not Saint class, but other Great Western steam locomotives which had gone for scrap. So this saved a lot of money and a lot of effort. This one is a big project. It's well on the way to completion. And when Prince of Wales, a 282, very unusual wheel arrangements for the UK, when Prince of Wales is back in or in service in the next few years, she will be our most powerful operational steam locomotive. And the Grange, this is another example of producing a new locomotive using one or two parts from existing types of redundant steam locomotive. So here we are, we've got this one here, and that is back in service last year. And then also ending up back in service towards the end of the summer last year, this was the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway Atlantic 442. Again, quite an unusual wheel arrangement for the UK. And she was built, virtually almost every piece was constructed at the Sheffield Park workshops of the Bluebell Railway. And she's now in service regularly down there. And this is just 4 snapshots of extinct classes of steam locomotive. And in each case, there is a preservation group well on the way to recreating these examples there. So it's slow, steady work. Occasionally a project will fail. You lose the vital management volunteers. You decide you can't raise enough money. All sorts of problems come up. But by and large, our program of slowly but very steadily restoring or recreating steam locomotives is going well ahead. And here's an example of a brand new narrow gauge steam locomotive. So a double fairly. They were so busy on Festiniog Railway, they needed another steam locomotive of this type. So if you were to go up to the Boston Lodge Works at Port Maddock in North Wales, this is the workshop, the very well-equipped workshop of the Festiniog Railway. And this one was built quite literally from scratch using their own facilities there. And a diesel mainline locomotive is being recreated. 1947, a pair of these 1,600 horsepower diesels were built by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. And they handled, sometimes double-headed, they would haul the fast express trains between London and Scotland. They didn't last very long, but they were the precursors, if you like, of all subsequent mainline diesels built here in the UK. And there's a project to recreate one of these locomotives. By the greatest of good fortune, they managed to find a power pack of exactly the same type that was originally fitted in this type of locomotive. They're going to put it on the frame, the underframe of a more modern diesel, which is astonishingly similar to the one on this one here. And it shouldn't be too long before we see this one, number 10,000, out on the tracks. This isn't a complete rebuild, but I had to put it in because it's such a quirky and attractive little item. Back in 1903, the Northeastern Railway introduced a very small fleet of these petrol electric auto cars. And so it goes down in our history because it's the very first petrol powered rail car. The Brighton Bell. In 1932, a brand new, first in the world, the only in the world, a Pullman electric unit service was created between London, Victoria, and the south coast town of Brighton. They remained in service until about 50 years ago. They were life expired, but most of the carriages survived in retirement. And in 2009, there was a project to restore one unit. Well, the very good news is that all these years later, they have done an unpowered trial run. So they put a diesel on each end of the carriages. They run it up and down at slowly increasing speeds to test the stability, everything else there. And it should be back in service or in service later this year. It runs on the third rail, the 750 volt DC. And so I have a particular interest in this one because where I live to the south of London is actually on this very extensive third rail electric system. So it shouldn't be too long before I can see the Brighton Bell actually coming through the station close to where I live. What about the challenges? There are all sorts of challenges for the future. And I think we'll go straight into looking into them in turn. In terms of finance and funding, if we look at the operational cost of the railway, you can see that on this typical example, only half of its income will come from people buying tickets to ride. The gift and souvenirs will bring perhaps 10%. Catering, whether on the train or on the stations, will bring perhaps 15%. And a lot of other items there, a mixture of perhaps charter trains, film contracts, using your own railway workshop to produce items for other people who could bring in another 25% there. In terms of the big hit items, the capital projects, the individual railways are always asking for donations for a specific item. They're encouraging people to leave a legacy in their will. They may, perhaps on a new locomotive project, they will ask you get people to sponsor a particular part. So for a certain number of pounds, you will buy a new boiler tube, or for a lot more money, you might buy the complete cab. You can make interest-free loans to the railway. You will get it back, but there won't be any interest on it there. But if you spare money, which you don't mind releasing for 5 or 10 years, that's very welcome. Many of them are limited companies, so they will issue shares, and so you can become a shareholder in your local railway. The Railway Heritage Trust provides funding for heritage items on the national network, but it also provides advice and support for the heritage railways, and a lot of money to the individual heritage railways doesn't come direct from government or public funds. It comes from our heritage lottery fund there. And so for all these tickets which are sold on the national network, a certain percentage of those lottery funding are allocated to conservation and railway projects. There's never enough money to go round, but if you're a railway and you bid for a certain amount of money from the Heritage Lottery funds, even if they refuse the first time round, they will look at your application very carefully and they will give you advice and actually encourage you to perhaps put a resubmission in at a later date. What about coal supplies? Well, we no longer have any British coal mines, but our heritage railways need 35 tonnes of it a year. The government is being lobbied by the Heritage Railway Association to allow small-scale operation of coal mines in this country. The short-term solution at the moment is costly import. So some coal may come from Colombia, for example, some may come from Poland, but also there's work going on developing a range of sustainable alternatives there. And for example, using biomass, effectively compressed wood, that's been successfully trialled on a narrow gauge line. And the Heritage Railway Association only today I was looking at it just before I logged on. They've issued a big consultation document to chart out a way forward on this. You do have to be careful of what coal you use, though. You've seen most of the pictures I've shown you. The smoke isn't black, it's white. And that is the norm, and it has to be the norm. If you've got a properly maintained steam locomotive with a properly trained crew and exactly the right quality of coal, then this is what you will get. And the heritage railways, they don't want to annoy their neighbours. They don't want to cause problems of people complaining about air pollution from their activities. What about the workforce?
Paul, can I interject? I think we've got about 8 minutes left.
Yeah, that's
We
fine.
need
Yeah,
5 minutes for some questions, a lot of questions.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Okay, so aging workforce, that's the solution. Constant recruitment, encouraging youth people there and looking after them with mentors and trainers there. Again, you don't have to be a man to have your own steam locomotive, and constant encouragement of youngsters. The guy on the left-hand side, he's working through his college holidays there. Heritage engineering skills, most of the lines have to be independent. They produce their own equipment, but there are still a small network of specialist providers. Thomas has had a mention there, a major fundraiser. A reenactment is important. For example, on the left-hand side, we're on World War II territory there, and a surprise visitor was none other than Winston Churchill. And considering how old he must be now, it's no surprise that he's brought a nurse and a wheelchair with him. Santa specials are important at Christmas time. Even if there's no snow, they will bring in lots and lots of children. Photography is important, and filming is important as well. On the right-hand side, on the Bluebell Railway, we've got Queen Victoria arriving. I was visiting a local heritage railway in 2022. I walked onto the platform and there was a film crew from Calcutta. And the producer spotted me and she came up and said, are you doing anything for the rest of the day? And I said, well, no, why? And she said, well, it's a bit embarrassing, but we haven't got a station master. Well, the outcome was that I made my Bollywood debut. The price was a cup of chai, chocolate digestive, and the promise to give me £40 for half a day's filming. And sadly, that £40 has never arrived. There, Bob. Safety is important, pretty well up to national network standard there. Climate change, well, a brief list of all the conditions there. There is a lot of extra work going in. That bridge in the middle there collapsed just a couple of months ago. A constant extra vigilance needed in looking after the tracks there. But there we are, the end of it. And I'll look forward to this multitude of questions you've got for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a wonderful run through, wide spectrum, lot of interest generated, I'm sure. I will, many of these questions you've already answered. One question was about regular running. Another question was about skilling. But I would like Mr. Vinu Mathu's question to come through because it's very relevant to India. He says, how do volunteers develop skills in locomotive working, signaling, track maintenance? Is there a formal training system?
Yeah. In terms of the all-important and safety critical aspect, for example, of boilers, there's a national trust set up. It's basically under the auspices of the Heritage Railway Association. So anything to do with boilers, which of course can be very, very dangerous, they're high pressure vessels. So boilers is singled out for special attention. In terms of training, the individual railways are accountable to the safety inspectorate for ensuring that their staff are adequately trained. So largely it's down to each of them because they've got their own particular issues of equipment, their own particular requirements, but there's not a national training session. You have to bear in mind that some of these volunteers actually have a normal full-time job on the national network. Funnily enough, some of the heritage railways are actively involved in training signalling staff on the national network because the heritage railway may well have some of the same type of antique signalling equipment that is still in use on the national network. So sometimes the flow of expertise and training goes in the opposite direction from what you might expect.
Right. One question from my side. You see, you told us about the alignments which were closed in 60s and 70s, and then once again, they were revived by these several railways which you talked about, like Festinov or Bluebell. Now,
Yeah.
what had happened to the land or the alignment which was there? Was it lying vacant? Number one. Number two, who did it belong to? Obviously, it must have belonged to the government because these were government railways earlier. And then how did the private heritage railways take over this land, and what were their conditions? Any idea?
Yep. Okay, that's fine. In an ideal world, when these railway routes were shut down, someone should have had the foresight to realise that whilst at the time rail travel was in steep decline, there might be an opportunity in the future for that railway to be reopened. So, unlike in some more sensible European countries where a closed line was effectively mothballed, British Railways were keen to realise the value of these closed railway routes. So in some cases, they were very, very hasty in selling off the actual track alignment or places along the track alignment, which could be sold off for housing, factories, and so on there. And really, this then determined decades later whether there was any realistic possibility of that railway being reopened. Because if you had to try to get housing removed, factories removed, and so on there was a problem. So the restored railways have tended to be restricted to places where the basic line of the route is still intact. So what happened to it? In quite a few cases, the land was actually sold off to private owners. And a farmer who hitherto had his fields divided by a railway track there, he could, there were no sleepers or rails to worry about. He would simply drive from one side to the other there. So sometimes in almost indecent haste, the rails were ripped up. The luckier heritage railways, if they got their act together and if they got the finance together there, if they moved in quickly, then the track and the stations were still intact. And that made life much easier for them. On the many areas of disused line, some of the structures are in a body. I think it's called a residual body of British Railways, and there is a statutory obligation on them to maintain some of these more attractive, sometimes absolutely quite wonderful viaducts there. So some of them you will see a disused railway line. And all the rest of the route has disappeared, but you'll then come across a wonderful viaduct, which was perhaps been preserved as a footpath route there. So nothing is really totally abandoned, but yeah, there was this short-term selling off of some of the routes there. When you look back at those beaching cuts, they reckon now that for every 3 miles of line shut by beaching, one of them, if the route was still available, would be brought back into public use there. There's been a complete sea change in how much people want and need to use the railway system.
Right. We are now touching 2 minutes. One last question from Aditya. He says, what motivates people to make steam engines in UK today? Is it the government or private companies, and how do they get the return?
Yeah, it is absolutely nothing to do with central government. It's down to individual groups of enthusiasts who just have this great affection for steam, but sometimes in particular for a particular type of locomotive. So no one decides which new type of steam locomotive will be built other than the people who are actually going to make it happen. And I think this is the secret of the success of our heritage railways. The government has really no part in it there. If we can get people together with enthusiasm to restore a heritage railway, build a new steam railway there, one mustn't underestimate the huge power of individual enthusiasts here.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we'll have to continue this conversation in one of our monthly talks from you, because right now we have got over 300 locomotives recorded by one of our friends, Vikas, in his books in India. And there are many running. There are many in the private, as you said. India is in the cusp of developing organizations and people who would have the deep pockets to run private railways, heritage railways. And I suppose RES and you and DHRS should work together to enthuse people to go forward. And for this, our talks are most important. We'll carry this forward later. But thank you very much for bringing in front of us a wonderful session. Thanks again. Good luck. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy. Thanks, everyone.
Over to Manoj.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul, for a wonderful session. If I can add a small line, in your CV, you can also add that you have acted in a Bengali movie. So that will also be a good thing. Thank you, Mr. Mukherjee, for spearheading this wonderful session.